Welcome, everyone, to the latest episode of the Project Liberal podcast. My name is Josh Eckle. I'm the president of Project Liberal. I'm joined, as usual, today by Max Marty from our steering committee. Hello, Max.
Hello, hello.
Pleasure to see you. And today we're joined by a guest who I'm a huge fan of, who I think has a similar journey to many of the people involved in Project Liberal, Mike Brock. Mike is the former CEO of TBD. He was on the leadership team of Block, formerly known as Square. He spent a career in Silicon Valley in tech. And today we wanted to bring him on to talk about not only his ideological journey, but also what's happening in Silicon Valley and dig into that story a bit. So, Mike, thank you for taking the time to chat with us.
Thanks for having me here, Joshua. And congratulations on launching this podcast and launching Project Liberal. Very excited about all the things you guys are doing, and happy to be part of this very important conversation.
Awesome. Yeah, we're looking forward to it. We're looking forward to it. So, I wanted to kick off the conversation to give some context to our listeners on your background. I know that this is the story of a lot of people from our leadership team and a lot of people in our orbit. I personally considered myself a libertarian for a long time. I've spent a lot of time in those circles. Recently, the word libertarian doesn't mean, I think, in the minds of the public what it meant to me when I kind of really embraced those values, say 10 or 15 years ago. It's evolving. And then there are some good, reasonable critiques of this really purist version of libertarian philosophy. But you've also spent a lot of time working in Silicon Valley, and you've got a journey to share there. So I just wanted to maybe open it off by asking if you could share a little bit about your background, not only your career, but your ideological journey that kind of brought you to where
Yeah,
you're at now.
absolutely. Yeah, so I've had a pretty interesting journey throughout my life. At a very young age, I found myself deeply involved in politics, actually. I know that you are previously of Students for Liberty. When I was younger, I had many run-ins with them, attending many of their events, and in fact, some of my friends today still harken back from those days of me being deeply enmeshed in the libertarian movement. Um, Before I found my way back into business, first as a consultant, then as a software engineer. I learned to program at a very young age, got into politics, went back into programming. Uh, Turned out I was quite successful at it, so kept going and found my way all the way up into the echelons of executive management at Square, which became Block. Obviously, we went public and became a publicly traded company. So my trajectory was interesting. And my ideological journey, having started in libertarianism, much I guess like your own, found its way, I think, back to something that's like more akin to classical liberalism. For me, I think probably the breaking point for me was quite a long time ago, actually. I was writing for a Canadian libertarian journal known as the Western Standard, owned by a man by Ezra Levant, who now runs something called The Rebel out of Canada. Former friend of mine, as it turns out. Him and I don't really talk much anymore. But I really broke from the libertarian movement during the Tea Party era. I recognized that there was something deeply wrong with some of the people around me, and what was going on. Like during the first term of the Obama administration, it became very clear to me that people around me and in my circle in the libertarian movement were not optimizing for the same goals that I was, which was some universal conception of liberty. And I realized that there was something far more pernicious going on, which was this insistence on the primacy of property rights above all, which I then started to realize was the linchpin of a lot of white supremacy that was connecting itself into the libertarian movement, which actually culminated in a very interesting argument that I ended up having at a event in Canada. By the way, I'm a dual national. By the way, I'm a U.S. Canadian, Canadian American, or whatever you want to call me. Um,
You have a place to flee
and
to when the country falls apart. So
yeah, yeah. And and it was the first time I realized that I was in the presence of people who call themselves libertarians that had white supremacist views. And I remember what I said to the person at the time, and it always stuck with me. And I've used this turn of phrase over and over again, which was like, I think that the main reason why you're so obsessed with property rights is you just want the right to put up a whites only sign in the front of your shop. And this led to a massive debate, much to my surprise. The person in question, who I will not name, I'm not going to call him out, but he argued quite vociferously that I shouldn't see any problem with that as a libertarian, that I should keep my nose out of other people's business, that if people wanted to engage in racial exclusion on the back of their property rights, that was absolutely like, something that any libertarian should have no problem with. That was probably the moment connected with what was going on with like birtherism and Obama and the things I was hearing at that time, and I was just like, I don't know that I'm in the right group of people. I was I was someone who got very hooked on classical liberal philosophy growing up. Utilitarian, like utilitarian liberal philosophy and morality. Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, all of the important texts that one might read to onboard themselves into these ideas of English and Scottish liberty, were things that were near and dear to me. But I realized that whatever branch of liberalism I had found myself in, it had taken some pretty dangerous turns. And so I started at the time writing essays on the Western Standard, much to the chagrin of the editor there, criticizing the fetishization of property rights by libertarians and how it didn't connect to what I saw as a necessary claim on the collective good, which, for those people who've actually studied classical liberal philosophy pretty carefully, recognize that all of the sort of the fathers of liberal thought there was such a thing as a common good. I mean, John Locke, who in many ways is the intellectual grandfather of the Declaration of Independence, and certainly the most influential thinker on Thomas Jefferson, certainly thought that there were concepts like the common good and the general welfare and the importance of there being something bigger than yourself. So I think that was for me a breaking up point where I was like, look, I believe that there is something called a common good, and I think that there is a proper place for government to represent that common good, because there are market failures, there are perverse incentives, there are externalities that won't be captured by our own individual actions and economic activity, if not properly contained in some sort of envelope of something that represents a common interest. And so that was my breaking off point. And so I've been kind of in this like kind of, I don't know, you could say like, former libertarian mode now for over a decade. And for the most part, I had kind of like forgotten about it. I kind of like left this sort of part of my ideological journey in the past. And I kind of just maybe had turned into something more akin to like a boring political centrist. Trump era comes, obviously. For the first time in my life, I consider supporting a Democrat. So I support Hillary Clinton in 2016, which felt insane to me because, like, obviously, like most people associated with sort of right of center politics, that was sort of an anathema to me to have to think of supporting someone like Clinton. But I did, recognizing the threat that Donald Trump represented. And then I found my way into Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. And this is where I would come face to face with what I had experienced over a decade earlier, this malignant, absolutely destructive idea that property rights are the prime summum bonum of all of our ethical system, and recognizing how dangerous of an idea that actually is, and the only reason why someone would want to believe that is because they think that they're going to win at the economic domination game, and by extension the political domination game. So and I kind of like reawakened, having realized that this whole crypto and Bitcoin thing was reawakening a lot of this political thought and pushing it more into the mainstream, scarily into the mainstream. Even starting to like convert some people I considered friends and colleagues to these ideologies, and I just started like tweeting and blogging and like starting to like try and provide people with like counter arguments, to these, what I see as like very dangerous ideas that are not really conducive to actually building a stable civilization, particularly in an era of advanced science and technology, where the stakes are very, very high. We have the capacity to kill ourselves. We have to remind ourselves of this. Like, we have nuclear weapons, the ability to now print genes, which we can insert into bacterium and create super bugs that could potentially kill us all. Like, we are going into an era where the importance of there being a common good and someone to protect it, that being, I think, a liberal polity within a democratic way, a democratic system of self-government and constitutional government, and the preservation of that, which I think we're very much on the same page about all that, is paramount. We have to be able to engage with this, or like, I think the capacity for human survival is very much in question. And I know that sounds like a very crazy thing to say out loud, but I mean, if you just sit and think about it, you realize it's very much the case. So we didn't even mention AI, and that's obviously very much another existential problem that we need to think about.
I was just going to ask a quick sort of clarification, Mike. When you talk about the common good, or some sort of social benefit that's writ large to society, when I think of those terms, I think of one of two things. Either in sort of an economics context, when you graph things out and you recognize that there's a deadweight loss, right? And that deadweight loss is accruing to some number of people, like, if you have rent control, et cetera, you get a deadweight loss, all that. So that's one form that I would say, okay, that makes sense to call that a common good. The other one is like when you look at big aggregate numbers of, so for example, if like overall health indicators or overall life indicators are going up for a society, I would say that's the social good, or the common good, is being served within that society if we can point to some of those pieces of data. Is there something that you mean different than that, or are those?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. So I would generally, look, I guess I am. I'm an armchair philosopher of sorts. I think a lot about the nature. In fact, I'm starting to write a book on the nature of meaning and the crisis of meaning in our society. So I think a lot about what the common good means, which is obviously downstream of what philosophers might refer to as the good life, which I think in aggregate we might call human flourishing. Look, I think that I don't think there is I'm actually quite skeptical of quantified versions of what that means. I am of the belief that if there is like a familiar with the term, the summum bonum, the highest good, right? In terms of like thinking about like what that is, for me, I think it's like a existence in where as much different, I don't want to use overly technical terms, but I'll say it and then I'll describe what it means. Normative possibilities within a society can exist, like which is to say, normative being like things that are not like objectively true but are subjectively true. Like, for example, like you like classical music and I like hard rock, right? Like there's nothing you can really do to quantify which one of those things is good. You can sit here and make all these arguments about the sophistication of composing classical music vis-a-vis, like, composing a rock arrangement, which is far more simpler, and you can get in all these arguments. But at the end of the day, you're talking about subjective preferences. And I am very much of the thought process of David Hume, the famous Scottish philosopher, who famously he formed an argument known as Hume's guillotine, sometimes also known as the is-ought problem, that basically says that, no matter what's true about the world, whatever like facts or empirical observations you make about the world, there's nothing you can do with that will tell you what you ought to do with the world. And that is something that's kind of, I guess, at the core of what I believe as a classical liberal, which means that the subjective values that we all have are an important part of what make up that common good. And we have to negotiate that through a healthy political polity within some envelope of limitations on the power of the state to protect the individual's space in order to be able to self-actualize to a certain point, but also like realize that like we all can't just like do whatever we want. I can't do things that harm you. I can't do things that are going to place the collective society at greater risk. There's all these things that we have to negotiate. And the truth is, there aren't really any clear answers to those. This is why we need democracy. This is why we need deliberative democracy as we go, because new technologies change, trends change, culture changes. We have to constantly renegotiate as all these normative possibilities that we create for ourselves through our experimentation and our cultural shifts and our kids getting into weird and crazy new trends. We have to figure out how to integrate that into our society in a way that allows us to maximize those possibilities. Because like why wouldn't we want to let people try to experience the good life in as many different ways as they can? That's like that for me, and I know that's just not something you can quantify. I think it's something that you can only constantly renegotiate. Our values aren't the same today that they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, certainly not 100 years ago. We wouldn't. That's how I view it.
I want to push back just a little bit, Mike, and I appreciate you being a good sport about this, but I can just tell that there's going to be a lot of people out there who hear the words common good and such and bristle a little bit. So I'm trying to devil's advocate on their behalf here. Yeah. So as, again, thinking in an economics term, I would say there is a way to try to quantify this. So we were talking, you're saying, okay, what if I like classical music, you like rock? Mm-hmm. So in a world where there's more rock bands, maybe you're happier. Mike's personal good is doing better. And in a world where there's more symphonies, I'm happier maybe. Yeah. Max's personal good is doing better. So what I would say, there's two things I would respond here. One is we can try to arbitrate between these two things through willingness to pay, right? Mm-hmm. So through putting your money where your mouth is, which just means opportunity cost, right? I'm willing to give up more in order to have a symphony than you are to have more rock bands. Therefore, I care more about symphonies than you care about rock bands. And that's one way to potentially deal with this matter. Of course, the all else equal, is doing a lot of heavy lifting here, right? We have different amounts of ability to pay and all this stuff, but setting that aside,
I think that is a pretty big. It's probably where I'm going to go with this at the end of your thing.
It's doing heavy lifting. The other one, of course, is to say, well, if we have both more symphonies and more rock bands, clearly there's some kind of aggregate good that's expanded. Right there, I think nobody would disagree.
Yeah.
So again, I'm trying to see if we can get to a place where, because I have to admit, I bristle a little bit when I hear common good, because I think, well, what that person across the street wants is not what I want. So there's some things that we maybe have in common, but not a lot, and not everything. So I'm trying to get to an agreement here.
It's a good I mean, it's a good point. I mean, but and this is going to be a very unsatisfying answer to the stalwart libertarians among us. And honestly, it's something that I have to accept, that there are a lot of things in this society that are very popular that I do not agree with, that are culturally popular, that are politically popular, and as much of a classical liberal as I am, and as much as and by the way, like I'm pretty free markets guy, generally speaking. I mean, I'm one of my also favorite bugbears is just literally attacking the left on their sort of local land use policies, which I think are actually probably the most destructive economic policies when it comes to affordability in this country.
For sure.
And I definitely put that at the feet of much of the left, but that's for another day. I think that the point that I would make is, look, let me just back up for a second here. I think from the perspective of defining what the common good is, we have to first accept that we live in a society with other people. We don't get to choose to not live in this society, in this country, on this planet. We are on this earth competing for resources. Yes, like we use property rights in order to create a fair system in order to also incentivize, like, economic production and all these fun things. But at some level, I'm going to have to accept that part of being a civilized person is living in a society with people who I disagree with, and sometimes having to accept that I have the minority view on some things. And it is a relatively immature stance to say, well, I didn't choose to be born into this world. I didn't choose this policy. Why am I paying for the these the weapons that are going to Ukraine? I don't think we should be doing that. How dare you take my tax dollars? It's like this. My only response to you is like too fucking bad. Like, you live in a society and you have, and this is part of the social contract, which libertarians will say, I didn't sign the social contract. It's like, I know you didn't, but like we did for you because you're part of this society. And guess what? Like, if you decide that you're just going to ignore the social contract, we are going to use our laws and our the systems of order in our society to protect that common good against your relatively immature take that, like, because you didn't agree to this, that you don't have to go along. Well, you do. You have to go along in this, and we have to do this our entire lives. Like, we have to go where our parents tell us we have to go when we're growing up, right? Like, we're not in a state where we can stand on our own 2 feet. If there's bombers overhead, and we're in a war, and people are telling you to turn off the lights so bombers can't target the city, and you're like, well, I don't care, I want to keep my lights on. It's like, well, no, fuck you, right? Like, you're like, we're gonna, like, we're like, there's no, this isn't like an interesting argument when you get down to like brass tacks. Like there's, like, you can really, like, basically get into these, like, metaphysical debates with yourself around, like, what you ought to have to do, or what obligations you have to other people, which I think is at the core of a lot of pernicious libertarian thought. It's like, yeah, like, you don't actually have to act in any particular way. You don't have to stand up for my rights. You don't even have to respect my rights. But it turns out that we're an organized society, and if you act or fail to act in certain ways that are deleterious to what the rest of us, through our deliberative bodies, through our legislatures, through our courts, through all the things that we've created in order to create a liberal polity, doesn't if you don't if you're just gonna like basically force yourself against that grain, yeah, like we're like bad things are gonna happen to you, and that's just always it's just like that's just Locke's, John Locke's social contract, and that's how. And honestly, most people. Here's the other crazy thing too. We talk about this, and I know that I'm like talking to a hypothetical libertarian right now who's sort of like falling out of their seat. But here's like the reality: what I just said to 90% of people sounds completely fucking reasonable. Like this is the thing that I think that libertarians like sometimes like forget. Is like you're sitting around like the dinner table with like your family or some random people, and you just talk about these things in these terms, like, and I think as a lot of libertarians get older and some people like move into sort of their former libertarian state, they come to like recognize this is like when you actually ask people like point blank, like on like some of these on some of these like topics, like people are like, yeah, like I think you have a some obligation to society. What are you talking about, right? Like this is actually like a trick that libertarians, I think, particularly when we're young in our 20s and we're stupid, play on ourselves, that we think that like most people intuitively think in this sort of like libertarian way. That's actually not true, and I think it's especially not true, I think, for a lot of women that I've grown up. I don't know if people have realized this, but I certainly realized this. But like the libertarian movement was very much a movement of young white men when I was growing up that seemed to have absolutely no serious consideration for the fact that like like we're part of a liberal polity where like women have equal rights as well, and they don't really seem to be part of any of these conversations, which is another example of where I think this this philosophy is terribly incomplete. If only by looking at by the people who it did not include in the conversation.
I've had similar. I definitely don't have to. I'm not going to fight you on that. I've had absolutely similar experiences. I speak when I join these conversations less as a philosopher and more of a tactician and an organizer, because that's kind of what I've done. So I've had the exact same experience that you have, where it seems like a self-apparent principle to me. You go to the public and it just doesn't click. It actually comes across as very selfish, and it comes across as very myopic, or just doesn't really have the full picture. And that, so when I look at the picture, when I look at the situation, I say from just a broad-based perspective, what I'd like to see is a society that has more economic freedom, that has more individual freedom, and that protects political freedom, that where we have the ability to have a voice in our government, we have the ability to say things. So libertarians get so fixed on these rigid philosophical arguments, and this is part of the problem with Hoppe. It's like libertarian philosophy and this obsession on property rights has brought these coalitions together in a libertarian movement that are fundamentally.
He is actually a fascist. He is like literally just a fascist.
Yes, he is. But these people are sharing the same coalition. And so where I was going with this from a political organizing perspective, I've spent a lot of time looking at the work of Steve Davies, and Steve Davies talked about this political realignment that's playing out across the Western world. And what he's basically articulated is there's two major forces at the two ends of this pole here that are basically forming right now. And it's the cosmopolitan liberals versus the populist authoritarians. And one of the main things that divide these two groups is basically an openness to the world versus being closed off to the world, and a pursuit of dynamism and innovation versus stability and order. Now, when you take that and you put it and you map it on top of the libertarian coalition that has existed for the last 50 years, you could see why there would be some tension. Because, I mean, libertarian philosophy, if we're just talking about broad property rights, can bring two types of people to it. You can have people like I gather, everyone on this call. For me, the draw to libertarian philosophy was, I want everyone to be free. I believe in the universalism of liberty. I want people to, have their rights protected and be able to innovate and grow and build a future for themselves and not be coerced on. But in the same vein, it can bring these people on the other side.
You don't pine for submission?
No, absolutely. And that's what I'm saying. These other people came to the movement for a completely different reason. They said, I want to protect my property. I want to keep you off of it. It's a closed offness to things. It's a desire for stability. And fundamentally, we find ourselves in two different camps in this moment in history. And that's why the movement, I think, is schismed and fractured. And I think a lot of people like yourself found this out 10 years ago. For me, I was coming out of college during the Tea Party movement. So my journey was a little bit different. But that, I think, is why there's so much turmoil and why I think this coalition is fundamentally going to look different going forward. And it's part of the reason why we started this project, is I think we need to build a cosmopolitan liberal coalition with people that are kind of united by a desire for openness, freedom, and dynamism.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, I don't want to like get too into like bore people to death, and we get into like the technical sort of philosophy of all of this. But I do want to say though, this idea of individual liberty, and the way that we think about it, right? Which I think is a very distinct concept from like what we might think of as just sort of like absolute individual freedom. I mean, what does freedom mean? I mean, freedom means like the ability to operate within sort of like degrees of freedom. Like what kind of degrees? I mean, we operate in obviously 3D space. I can freely move my hands through the air. I can't move them through the camera. I'm limited in that. Obviously, we have. This is obviously the most reductionist form of freedom. And then we obviously get into like arguments of like freedom of opportunity and freedom of outcomes, or all these arguments that the left and the right go back and forth on. And it's not quite clear, right? Like what, even from me, from a liberal perspective, like what the perfect universal definition of what freedom is. But what I will say this is that like we are more free living in, and this, I mean, it goes back to like Hobbes, right? I mean, I think Thomas Hobbes is the original liberal, by the way. I know that's a controversial take, but this recognition that by coming together in a society and giving up a little bit of our freedom to a government or a collective body that represents us, we all get something in return. We don't have to watch our backs as much because we don't have to work. Like we're not part of what Hobbes called the state of nature, right? Like we're not constantly being hunted. We're not. It isn't just like every man for himself or every woman for herself. It isn't just like a bunch of primitive tribes roving about, like trying to like compete for grazing land. We get something out of giving up quite a bit, actually, and that's that. This is for those who are interested. This is covered in Thomas Hobbes's famous The Leviathan, which brought birth to social contract theory, of which John Locke, who's associated with classical liberalism, developed it more into a liberal formulation. And I think that to me is something that I think about a lot, because if all we were trying to do was optimize for the maximum amount of our own personal freedom, then I don't know if you guys have seen Tom Hanks's movie Castaway from the 1990s, when he got stranded on an island. I mean, that should be just about like the most utopian vision to you, if like completely unmitigated personal freedom, unmolested by anyone else, not having to contend with the potential disagreements or contending for the resources among any other humans, and just like basically having complete dominion over the land and everything that you touch and eat and breathe. That should be quite an exhilarating idea to you. But I don't think most people would want to be stranded alone on an island with no one to talk to and no experiences, no no movies to see, no songs to sing or to be heard. We live in a society, and we gain so much from that society. We gain our language from that society. Like I didn't invent my own language. I'm speaking the language of my family and my ancestors right now, and speaking English. Although I'm half of my family's Polish, and I have to confess I do not speak Polish. But I think there needs to be like a deep recognition, I think, in any serious liberal, that what we think of as freedom is kind of sitting atop of a bunch of freedoms that we have given up for very good reason. So we can move away from the politics of mere survival to something that philosophers sometimes call the politics of distribution. So I think that's where liberalism wants to be. It wants to be in the politics of distribution. It's like we all now agree that we all have certain rights. We all have like this conception of liberty in the liberal frame. And what we're really doing in our politics is really just figuring out how to organize our resources, our scarce resources. That's the politics of distribution. I think, like you, I think my answer for the politics of distribution as it pertains to economic production is, I think, markets and strong property rights, markets, well-regulated markets, and generally the capitalist mode of production have proven themselves to be the thing that can raise people out of poverty. It has unleashed innovation that I think previous generations couldn't have even imagined. So that's where I think that I am on that. I think there's debates to be had around like what should we do with things like healthcare, for example. I think I used to be very much opposed to there being more government involvement in healthcare, but even looking at it from a free market perspective and realizing that there is a serious market failure here, and I think the whole like Ron Paul argument that what we need to do is just add so much competition that it becomes so cheap that it doesn't matter anyways, is not really a good argument when you actually like tease it apart. There does seem to be a problem there with like how risk gets pooled and how you get into these like situations where certain people, just through their upbringing, through their health circumstances, their genes, are just going to be fucked. They're just not going to be economically viable and able to, like, there might be treatment for them that would allow them to live a relatively healthy life, but it could be relatively expensive, and it could exceed the amount of economic output that person is ever going to have. So I know the argument might be that we should leave that to the church collection plate, but I think that I think there's an argument to be made there that we should look at things like that, and we say, look, like we're a capitalist society. We still believe in property rights. People can still become billionaires, but you know what? We're gonna like take a little bit of income tax, and we're gonna make sure that like that person, because like we believe in fucking human dignity, is going to be able to live something like a dignified life. Not just because of them, but because of the people that surround them, because of their mother and their brothers and their sisters and their friends that like gain like so much happiness from like the jokes that they tell and the experience that they have with that person, that keeping that person alive, because you know what, we're a super rich society and we have some excess resources that we can actually do things like that. I don't know, like I understand that like we libertarians think that that's like the path to totalitarian communism or something, but like I think no, I think in a liberal polity, like we can talk about the politics of distribution like that a little bit, and we can look at those things.
Max,
I want to
briefly, I was going to say, we do even within our coalition, we have people, I think where I get off the train on that conversation is, state-only option, right? Like I think the idea, like a Medicare for all.
That's a terrible idea.
Yeah, like a Medicare for all.
There's only three countries. There's only three countries in the world that impose a state-only option. By the way, on healthcare, and that is the United Kingdom, the NHS, which is a terrible. Actually, I don't even know that's completely true, but Canada, under an act called the Canada Health Act, which prohibits private insurance and private pay. It's a very deleterious system. The other is Cuba, and the other is North Korea.
Yeah.
I definitely do not think that the United States should ever move into an area where the federal government or even a state government takes over the complete control and provision of healthcare. I think that would be a terrible idea. What I do think that we should be doing is looking at things like the insurance industry and risk pooling. Like I honestly, I don't think that like a lot of the core ideas of Obamacare are even that bad. It's basically a compromise with the insurance industry. They're just basically saying, look, like you guys can like run your insurance schemes and you can do your underwriting models, but sometimes someone's going to show up to you at your door and they're going to have cancer, and you're going to look at them and you're going to say, we're going to lose a lot of money on this person if we take them on. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to give you taxpayers' money to pay for that person so you can have them as part of your plan. You get some kind of you get economy of scale benefits out of that. You can manage the care and you can find ways to create efficiencies. But like we're going to like take that. We're gonna pay for a little bit of that risk for you. I think it's actually a relatively reasonable, pretty like market oriented approach that has like nothing to do with the socialist or communistic formulations that I think a lot of. I mean, look, the ACA is actually quite popular now. When you look at it in polls, it's like over 60% of people or something like generally like agree with it. And by the way, it probably could be a lot cheap. I mean, look, the individual mandate, by the way, probably should have been kept. It would have kept prices down. If we gave people a little bit of a penalty, a nominal penalty every year, people would be much more inclined to buy health insurance. And if they did that, it would put more money in the insurance pools and that would reduce premiums. I mean, that was actually like a really sane like thing, but like Paul Ryan and it zeroed it out. And I don't think the Democrats look like they want to reopen that can of worms. But that is actually something that would lower costs by. But I think generally speaking, I think that's the kind of thing that I think is okay for us to be doing in our
Mike,
society.
I want to drag us back a little bit, kicking and screaming here, to a point you made earlier. And again, I'll be persona non grata in this conversation and defend the libertarians a little bit.
Please.
But please
we have a full-on debate if you want.
I love that. Yes. And by the way, I used to call myself a libertarian. I don't anymore, precisely because of what we're talking about. There's too many people out there who use that term that aren't what I mean by it. It's just and I don't like it, and I don't want to be associated with some of that stuff. But a lot of the libertarians that I used to know I think they would push back on this idea that the summum bonum is to be Tom Hanks, on the deserted island, and sort of seeing that as the ultimate form of freedom. Maybe some libertarians think that's the ultimate form of freedom. The ones that I know wouldn't say that, because they would say being within groups and acting with other humans is incredibly important. Yeah, but it is a voluntary interaction. So when you sign a marriage contract, it is limiting your freedoms. Very obviously, if it's not, you're doing it wrong, right? So, and since your freedoms are being limited in that way, you're trading those freedoms for something better, for something beautiful, for something that you want, and so is the other person, and it's voluntary. And so I think that a sort of network, a string of a lot more voluntarism in life is what a libertarian would. Now, some things, you're right. Some things may have to fall back on a social contract. You know, the usual minarchist arguments, well, yeah, defense, courts, police, fine, you get all that. Everything else, let's do it as voluntary as we can. And then we can argue piecemeal about whether this or that has some negative externality we need to deal with in a social way. But I think that's what many of the ones, at least that I know, would argue in favor of, not the deserted island thing. So I don't know if you have some.
Yeah. So, okay, I mean, it's fair. Look, I don't think that what you describe is like the voluntarism, which is it's a beautiful sounding idea. This idea that everything we do, like as long as everything we do has some sort of voluntary component. I mean, I'll just start off by saying that I don't think this is a very cognitively stable idea. And boy, what I mean by that is when you start playing out various scenarios that aren't even that hard to think of, you start recognizing that things don't intuitively seem like they're going in the right direction. So let me tell like a little story, like a little like fictional story about a man named Bob. So Bob he's a really wealthy industrialist, very libertarian thinker. He's become one of the richest people in the world, and he decides, you know what, like I can't really seem to, despite all the money I'm putting into super PACs in America and all this other stuff, I can't really seem to convince people that we should build this sort of more, I mean, anarcho-capitalistic, Murray Rothbardian like type, or Robert Nozickian like society, where at the end of the day, like we're all just like engaging in voluntary relationships mediated by our property rights and contracts and all this other stuff. So Bob sets out and he decides to try and buy an island. He's going to create his own little island nation. Who cares which one it is? Just say he manages to find a relatively suitable island somewhere on the planet. And he goes to whoever the authorities are of that island and through a perfectly reasonable and legal contract buys the island. Leaving any kind of like crazy claims on like on whether or not that nation or person had a right to sell the island or not, just assume it's all above board from a sort of a libertarian philosophy perspective. And so he buys this island and he sets about colonizing it himself. So he like brings in experts to figure out like where should he establish his cities on the island, like where is he going to build his like administration buildings and all this. And he does this, and he advertises to libertarians or libertarian-minded people all around the world who want to come and live on this island and buy some property from him, which will be subject obviously to his contracts. His allotment of property is probably going to be under Bob's conception. Obviously, you're going to have to follow Bob's laws on that island, or he's going to have some sort of contractual right to kick you out. Seems pretty reasonable. And this all just like happens through all this like voluntary contracts, and we build up this entire nation. It's beautiful. This is beautiful. Like it's like propertarianism come into reality, and everything's going great.
And we call it Roatan.
And we call it Roatan.
Right.
And so we're in this situation, and this looks like a libertarian monarchy, right? Basically, this sort of like Yarvinian sort of like beautiful like society. But there's a problem, right? It relies on the benevolence of its owner. And so Bob dies. And his really sadistic and overprivileged and power hungry son Max inherits the island from Bob. And it turns out that when we review all these contracts, I mean, it's Max's island. I mean, at the end of the day, like everyone agreed that they were going to have to like follow like Max's laws and regulations. But Max is he definitely like likes the fact that he owns his island, and maybe he's like willing to respect these contracts and stuff. But like but Max has different plans. And he decides to start like, I don't know, like I don't know, like what let's just like imagine like what could happen here, right? Like Max decides that he's not gonna he doesn't want any more babies to be born on the island. Maybe he's like worried that like if people basically grow the population, they're gonna like overthrow him or something. I don't, whatever crazy psychotic thing that like Max thinks about. And Max is the owner of the island, and we have families and entire communities who have grown up on this island. This island is all they know. Like there's literally nowhere else a lot of these people can go. Their whole life is on this island. And then so a baby gets born, which violates the regulation, which Max, under the contracts that his father signed with everyone, had a right to impose. Does Max now like have a right to basically say that you need to go and throw that baby in the ocean right now because that baby is a trespasser? That baby never had a right on my fucking property. You knew that going into this before you had this baby. What is it about this baby's life and your desire to keep it alive and my desire to get it off my fucking property right now, because this is my fucking property and your parents signed a fucking contract with me? Where is it? Like, where is the like, and by the way, like this scenario, by the way, that I'm outlining for you is something that Nozick thought about and actually got into an argument with Murray Rothbard about. And actually, it was quite a disturbing problem for Robert Nozick, which is why I think if anybody who has read Anarchy State and Utopia very carefully can actually recognize the fact that Nozick is not completely convinced by his own arguments. He does have some worries about where I'm going with this. Because because now you're in this like conundrum where there is no like appeal to sort of like common good. There really only is Max's control of that fucking contract right now, and there's no court, there's no law system. Like you just literally signed your kids' lives over to hoping for the benevolence of a future leader, essentially a future monarch that was established through contracts and through like this voluntary exchange. And yet intuitively this looks like a authoritarian dictatorship now. And you now have all these like families and it's not really reasonable. What, they're just going to go fucking be refugees like another part of the world? Like, that's easier said than done. Well, anyways, the way that Nozick came at Rothbard about this, in a relatively famous argument that he had with him, had to do with a baby as well, and so Nozick said to Rothbard, he was like, "Look, so let's say a mother with a newborn baby is in her house." And she decides that she no longer wants to be an indentured servant to the baby. She doesn't want to breastfeed the baby or feed the baby anymore. She wants to keep all of her food to herself. She doesn't have that much money and she doesn't want to care for the baby. And so the baby is like crying. It's like crying out, for food, and is like literally like starving to death. And a next door neighbor basically hears the baby just constantly wailing, crying, wanting to be fed, by this mother who has just basically decided to withdraw her motherly services from the baby. And the neighbor is like, oh my God, looks in through the window and just like sees that the mother's like not caring for her, and makes this decision to break into the house to save the baby, to feed the baby. And so Nozick asks Rothbard, he says, okay, at this moment that the neighbor is breaking in, does the mother have the right to shoot this person intruding, who's trying to save the baby's life? Rothbard says yes. Rothbard says this is a very unfortunate situation because under his voluntarist ethic, the mother can't be compelled to care for the child against her will in an involuntary way. She has a right to protect her property rights. And therefore, like the person who wants to enter, which would require breaking through the door and damaging her property, which Rothbard says that she has a right to prevent with lethal force if necessary, the baby is just essentially, unfortunately, left to die. Rothbard's kind of argument is like, I don't really think this is really going to happen. Like, people have motherly instincts, but like, yeah, like there's nothing like unethical about that. It's sad. And Nozick was quite shocked by this. It was, and so like there does seem to be in this voluntarist ethic that seems so beautiful, the capacity to do things which seem pretty intuitively fucking evil. I think to like most humans, and the ethical system doesn't give you any answers to it. In fact, if you follow the ethical system to its T, the baby will starve to death. Like the libertarian voluntarist ethic does not have an answer. That doesn't involve the baby starving to death. And I'm like what the fuck kind of like complete philosophy, ethical philosophy is this?
I think though, Mike, so the way I think somebody in this camp would respond, and by the way, you're talking to somebody who started a seasteading company, so you can you can go ahead and put me in some box there, if you want.
But by the way, this is an inter-libertarian. This is Nozick arguing on.
Oh no, I know.
Like,
yeah, for
like,
sure.
Like this was Nozick arguing against Rothbard on this. This wasn't some like statist arguing against him. This was an internal libertarian debate of like, this is like a serious fucking problem with your voluntarist ethic.
And I'm no fan of Rothbard, right? I couldn't stand reading the guy even.
Can I swear on this podcast, by the way? I know
go
swear.
for it. Yeah, not regulated.
Yeah, go for it. So, but I think what I would say, what a lot of people I know in this camp would say, is sure, if you go 100% and you try to go for some kind of pure Rothbardian anarchist world, you're going to have these weird scenarios that nobody wants. Like nobody would press the button to make that kind of stuff happen. But it's not like we don't have these kinds of horrible scenarios in today's world, right? Look at North Korea, right? It's not, there's nothing capitalist about that place, but Kim Jong-un or the Kims or whichever Kim it is now treats it like his own personal property, like the whole state, right?
Yep.
Everybody's his every individual is his personal slave, and every piece of land is his personal property, and all the rest.
Mm-hmm.
Copy and
so,
sorry, keep going.
Yeah, no. So I think I think one answer to that, to the question that you're creating is, well, there's no reason to go to that extreme, right? You can have a world with 95% more voluntarism.
But once you do that, once you even grant the 5%, like you're letting in this thing that you're going to let in some involuntary component.
It's okay. So that's okay. It's okay to be a little bit impure, right? It's okay to be very, very minimalist, but still keep these things like, in this situation, no, the rest of people who are outside of that property have the moral responsibility, in fact, to go and stop something that happens to be going on in that property. Or if a baby is born on this island, You don't have the right to just take the baby and toss it over the cliffside because you don't like the way it looks or something, right? There's
But who enforces that in these societies? Who's the
right. So I
enforcer?
mean,
Who's the enforcer of these like higher laws?
it's hard.
If we are to call them that.
It's hard. Look at foreign relations, right? Who enforces? Who is out there trying to police the world to stop these kinds of horrible humanitarian disasters that we see going on all over the place?
Yeah.
Right.
I mean,
is it us? Is it U.S.? Maybe sometimes it is.
The anarchy of the world between nations, I think I would say supports my argument here, not the libertarians' argument that the imposition of law and order ultimately can lead to a net increase in freedom for everybody. Because in the world where it is just like lie, cheat, and steal, and piracy, and everyone out for themselves, you find, yeah, I mean, in fact, I think some people in foreign policy realist, I mean, I don't consider myself a foreign policy realist. I'm a little bit of an idealist, but like, do actually talk about Hobbes's state of nature at a nation level. And I think that that's a valid analogy here.
And I think libertarians of my ilk, or what I was, or whatever, would say the ultimate safeguard here should be the ability to leave, right? So, and of course, so the problem,
the right of egress. The right of egress, I think is a really important part of the liberal. But I think that, but by the way, I believe that as a classical liberal, I believe the right of egress is and in fact, it doesn't exist in the U.S. Constitution, but I'm very happy that the 1981 Canadian Constitution, by the way, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, actually does have an explicit constitutional right of egress.
It does in the U.S. to some extent. It does in the sense. I lived in California for 10 years, and now I'm in Texas here in Austin.
No, it's recognized. It's recognized, but it's not explicitly called out as in Canada. It's actually an enumerated right under its constitution. The right to, it says that Canadian citizens have a right to enter, remain in, or leave Canada. Is an explicitly enumerated right, and it's equivalent to the Bill of Rights.
Okay, so so we've got a half hour left. We've spent a good hour really digging into the nuance here. I want to try to map this to what's happening not only in Silicon Valley, but in society at large. So the first question that I wanted to ask was to tie back to some of the conversations we had around property rights, around the Rothbardian kind of ilk. Are there influences within this kind of dark enlightenment and new right that call back to some of those things that we've criticized in the Libertarian Party? Is this or the Libertarian movement, or is this an entirely new kind of brand? Because I mean, my understanding of Yarvin, he's got some association with this, right? I mean, like these ideas are kind of all in the same soup, so to speak. Can you speak a little bit to that, Mike? And maybe we could start talking a bit about how these things are materializing in Silicon Valley and on the broader right in the United States.
Yeah. I first like came across Curtis Yarvin's writings probably like 6 or 7 years ago. Somebody in my social circles was reading his blog and wanted me to like check it out. I started actually kind of just passively reading him. I mean, he's an amazing, I just want to say, like, I'm going to give him a little bit of credit. Like, his capacity for the way he does what I would say, like, engages in what I would say is normative storytelling, is very powerful. He's a very, very powerful communicator of his ideas, and he's very good at, like, sort of framing it in this very kind of emotionally resonant narrative that like gets you to sort of feel I mean to the extent that we have this sort of sense of like justice or injustice in us that kind of can like really ground us and like motivate us to refocus like our sense of like what who and what we should be supporting in society. He's very strong in that sense of really kind of captivating you and pulling you in. Particularly people who have, I think, come from like a libertarian persuasion. This sort of this, and I think that a lot of people in Silicon Valley come from a libertarian-ish
Yeah.
like persuasion, if not outright libertarian. Like some people will say, like there's this techno-libertarian thing that exists in Silicon Valley, and there's something about the things that he says that really speaks to people in Silicon Valley. And so I saw like over the years, the people talking, especially like during the Trump years, where I would actually agree with a lot of critics on the right. I think like left-wing excess as it pertained to a lot of cultural issues was running completely out of control in a farcical way, and this like in this like overreaction to the Trump era. And in that world, I think you got a lot of people in Silicon Valley that they could not help but notice how illogical and irrational a lot of these like far left progressives around them in their offices and their HR departments, at their company town halls, were being. And it created really fertile ground for like a lot of really smart people to really start thinking about like, okay, like maybe this whole sort of like democracy thing is not it. Like maybe what we need is like what this like Curtis Yarvin guy is selling, right? Like a responsible absolute monarchy who protects like the capitalist system and individual rights. And this started to make a lot of sense to these people because they saw what was happening. They saw I guess in their, I don't know, I don't want to speak for people, but I think in their views, like the dumb masses don't know what's good for them.
Yeah.
And I think that really has led to, I mean, and I think, and by the way, I think there's a lot of stuff going on in the psychology of these Silicon Valley people who've kind of gone in this dark direction too. I think a really important thing to frame for this as well, which I think really also pumped their ability to start going down these dark paths, was the fact that just 10 years earlier, they'd been kind of the heroes of America. Silicon Valley were the hero, like, in the Obama years, right? Like the rise of all the social media companies like Mark Zuckerberg, Jack Dorsey, Elon Musk, these guys, heroes, cultural heroes. And then less than 10 short years later, we're all now being blamed for the polarization of our politics, for monopolistic practices in the App Store, and suddenly Silicon Valley felt like they had a whole bunch of guns to their heads. And so they had this sort of cultural fall from grace. They now have these employees, and this is real. Like I lived through this. Like I'm not gonna like deny this. Like the extreme left-wing identity politics that seized the inner workings of Silicon Valley companies got fucking crazy. Like it got crazy. Like to the point, like, by the way, like I think that if you had like, I think if everybody at the time, if you were able to give like an anonymous survey at the time where everyone was confident that the answers to their survey questions would not get out and wouldn't like result in them losing their career or being canceled, I actually think you'd probably get like 80 to 90% of like people in Silicon Valley who would have agreed that it was fucking crazy, that you had this like 10% of people who were screaming really, really loud and had all this cultural resonance, and people were too afraid to talk out against it because it could be playing into MAGA or Donald Trump, led to this like really crazy like coming together of factors that provided, I think, fertile ground for what you then would see happen after 2020, which was the sudden migration of a lot of these figures from being, relatively centrist Democratic Party supporting figures into people who are, I don't know, meeting with Curtis Yarvin in Santa Clara, in the Santa Clara Valley once a month, and suddenly being taken by really far right ideas and visions of JD Vance getting into the White House and using the 25th Amendment to remove Donald Trump, and then imposing like a neo-reactionary government, which by the way, like some of these people talk about like amongst themselves, like this is not this is like an actual thing that is happening. And there's been some reporting on this, right? I know that Jessica Lesson at The Information, she did like a piece on this like recently. For those of you listening to this and hearing this for the first time, there's actually some pretty good like reporting and places like Vanity Fair, and there's been some, I think no, I shouldn't say that yet, but I may have given some perspectives to a journalist recently, but I would say this is something that has brought me great deal of alarm in recent years, because these people are relatively powerful. These are some, I mean, Elon Musk, I think, is one of the most powerful human beings that has ever lived.
Yeah.
In terms of the amount of influence he has, he far exceeds that of most countries on this planet. In fact, his influence is so vast at this point that he is in some ways is just like operating under his own rules. He has to have security clearance to be a executive at a defense contractor, which SpaceX is. And by the way, like even civilian rocket launches are regulated essentially as military under U.S. arms export regulations. He has to have security clearance. I don't think that if Elon Musk wasn't the founder and CEO of SpaceX, which the United States is completely reliant upon for access to low Earth orbit, its ability to continue the International Space Station program, NASA. I mean, we saw the farce that has happened with the Boeing Starliner. There's currently like no other option. There's no way that Elon Musk would be able to retain his security clearance based on the things he said publicly, joking about potential assassination attempts against Kamala Harris. There's no way that you could say something like that publicly and not lose your security. Like the fact that like he, I mean, even his like direct like personal relations like with Xi Jinping of the Chinese Communist Party, which are highly like worrisome. Like, has he ever said anything bad about the Chinese Communist Party? I mean, I don't know. But anyways, like this dark turn, I think most exemplified by Elon Musk. And I don't know how much he personally buys into Yarvin's philosophy. Yeah. I don't really think he does, from what I can tell. But I think I think a lot of the people around him do. I mean, I think maybe Peter Thiel does.
Oh yeah.
He very much does. I think others around him in that circle very much do buy into this philosophy, and it's hard to call it anything but seditious, um, counter-revolutionary to the American Revolution. These people are literally talking about like bringing an end to self-government and replacing it with absolute monarchy. Um, I like this is a stream of thought. And by the way, I don't think it's like a large percentage of Silicon Valley. In fact, I think 80 to 90% of the workers in Silicon Valley are still liberals that support the Democratic Party. What's really concerning here, though, is it's the owners of that capital. It's these venture capitalists. It's some of these executives that command this power. They command the attention and they command the money. Have started like taking, I would argue, like taking seditious steps. And I think JD Vance and his connection to some of these people is a very, very dangerous example of that, because I do believe that JD Vance is a Yarvinite. I do believe that a lot of his friends in Silicon Valley are Yarvinites, and I do believe that that it does occur. I actually don't. I think JD Vance's, by the way, his whole MAGA thing is an act.
Yeah.
I think it's an act to keep Trump from questioning his true agenda. I think, and the reason I think this is just like look at the past JD Vance. Read it. Go read his book. Go read Hillbilly Elegy. Like go look at all his interviews. Yeah. This is a very intelligent Ivy League educated man. He knows exactly what he's doing. And he's counting on the fact that Donald Trump will not survive his second term.
Yes, and
the people around him are counting on that too. That is exactly what Elon Musk is counting on.
So yeah, I mean, just for the record, I mean, yeah, JD Vance, I think, not only is the proof that these ideas have broken into the mainstream, JD Vance has praised, as you said, Curtis Yarvin multiple times. He said he's a friend with him. He identifies with his writings. And to your point, Curtis Yarvin is not even quiet about his call. I mean, he's called for a humane alternative to genocide. He's literally called for dictatorship. He said in a quote, Americans need to give up their dictator phobia. So it's out in the open. That's what he stands for. One of the things that's interesting to me, and Max, you might have
these people go to discussion salons with Curtis Yarvin in the South Bay, and just so you know, like some of these figures, it's fucking crazy.
It's horrifying. And the thing that really blows me away is, and I think you probably had a similar experience, Mike, is when I was coming out of college, Peter Thiel, for example, was at the same types of events that I was going to. I mean, he was at SFL conferences 10 years ago, right? He considered himself a classical liberal, libertarian. And now I think he just came out and had an interview about a year ago where he said liberalism has failed. And we know he's part of this entirely new wing. You've touched on a lot of the questions that I was going to ask. But do you think that the reason, so I guess the thing I wanted to end cap on here and then maybe hand it to Max was, do we think that this was caused by, I mean, wokeism was a component. It was caused by, when I say wokeism, I mean kind of that far left capture of those institutions in Silicon Valley. Do you think there was anything else that really made these people just give up on liberalism? Like, do you have any other thoughts on maybe the reason?
I mean, it's their own ego, right? Like, there's this sense that I think was always there in Silicon Valley in the early days, right? Like, if you worked at Google, you thought you were saving the world. You thought you were essentially building the new world. You were building this new online egalitarian, hyper-connected like world, and you essentially were designing utopia. That's how I think a lot of these tech entrepreneurs and founders who got immensely rich, essentially just like selling advertising. Google's an advertising company. That's what it is. um, and they and they still, I think, haven't fully contended with the very degenerate aspects of human nature that advertising engagement economy has actually tapped into, right? Like just with humans just chasing dopamine hits, sometimes to very destructive ends. Um, I think we're now limiting our kids' screen time. Like if you're a parent today, like every parent is like trying to figure out how to minimize the time that kids spend on screens, and we're doing this because we recognize there's something seriously fucking wrong,
Yep.
right, with this online world. And these people are unable to contend, I think, in their own minds, within their own cognitive dissonance. Not that they, by the way, like I think these people have good intentions. I really do. Like I know a lot of these people, and I worked with them, and some of them my dear friends, and they continue to be my dear friends. Some of them, like, are on different aspects of the spectrum than others when it comes to like recognizing the effects that these things have had on people. But yeah, it's really hard to think to yourself, I became a multi-billionaire um, on a really, really successful business venture that doesn't isn't necessarily I think a positive for humanity. That's a very hard thing for some. Like, I mean, you could imagine if you follow that path down, that could be a very, very hard psychic space for a human to inhabit, in terms of like the amount of like guilt and sense of
No.
injustice that you represent being. And I think that's a very, very hard thing to accept. And so I think we know what humans do. We know what we all do. We rationalize things. And they are as convinced as ever that they have all the answers. And in fact, it's the other people who are wrong. That if we just had our way, if it wasn't for these overwrought government regulations, if it wasn't for Lena Khan at the Federal Trade Commission, this like things would be better. Like, look, it's self delusion. I mean, that's what it ultimately comes down to. We all want to be heroes in our own story, and we all tend to, myself included, definitely myself included, overestimate our own abilities.
Um, I wanted to ask a quick one here, Mike. I was enmeshed in all this stuff in the early 2010s as well in the seasteading world, and Curtis Yarvin made the rounds, and I read his stuff. Everybody else I knew was reading his stuff. Um, but a lot of the people that I know didn't end up going down this dark enlightenment path, myself included. I read it and I was
Yeah.
like, it's some interesting stuff, but I don't agree with a lot of other things, and so I didn't go down that path. What do you think? Kind of, why is it that some people read that stuff? Coming from a similar, I think, background, and I also had a very kind of starry-eyed idea of Peter Thiel when I was working at the Seasteading Institute, and then I started a seasteading company. He was like this pinnacle of like, ooh, classical liberal cosmopolitanism, techno optimism, which I still think of myself as a techno optimist, and I still think of myself as trying to make the world better in that way. But I didn't happen to go down that path. So what do you think it is that made the difference between the people who ended up going in that direction, like the JD Vances or whatever, and the people who were in a similar starting point but didn't end up going that way?
Yeah, I think there's like three broad categories of people, I think, that I've sort of like coded in my brain to kind of explain the divergence here. I think, I mean, I think a lot of people who come at this from a deontological place, right? Or sort of a natural law place, people who have this sort of like really fixated on this idea of like uh, our our rights and our dignity like kind of precede law in society, that kind of like thought process. that that tended to be, I think, the kinds of people who are more likely to go down the dark path. Another group of people, which I think Thiel um, uh, codes into, is what I would call the scientism path. This very like mechanical reductionist philosophy of the world, that sometimes also gets associated with the new atheist movement, sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly. I think sometimes maybe fairly, and in the case of, say, like Richard Dawkins, maybe less fairly in the case of, say, someone like Sam Harris. But like I think that kind of like thought process as well can be very um, I see those kinds of people, and you like this sort of hyper rational world that just views everything as like an optimization function at some level, can find itself drawn towards this kind of thinking. And then I think there's another group of people, myself included, I sometimes refer to as sort of like the romantics. We don't tend to attach ourselves to deontological ethics. We're usually more associated with utilitarian thought, right? Like Jeremy Bentham. I mean, most people don't recognize this, but basically every single classical liberal philosopher, all the way up, including, by the way, Mises, including, by the way, Hayek, counted themselves as moral utilitarians, of that bent. I mean, liberalism in many ways was I think a lot of conservative thought in the 20th century gets really confused about this and thinks that, like, yeah, like that utilitarianism is just like associated with like Marx and Marxism and socialism. That's just completely not true. In fact, both socialist, Marxist, and liberal thought were all kind of contained within the predominant moral utilitarianism of the time, and they all lived inside that world, with just different epistemic conclusions around like around what the actual utility function was, right? With like Adam Smith, for example, thought that the invisible hand, right, was a way of thinking of the utility function, of the economy. But like, but he was a utilitarian. He was a moral utilitarian. Um, so I think those people were way more, like myself included, were way more resistant to this. We recognize that things are a lot more complicated. There's interdependent relationships between us and other people and government and the common good, and it's not just so simple. You don't just solve these problems by teasing these things apart. If we just bring in a monarch or a dictator, like we know how this goes. We know what happens next. We've seen this before. I think those are like the broad like distinctions. I recognize that we're short on time
Yeah.
and probably can't get too deep into them, but those are kind of like the three ones that I've sort of like, as I've sat and pondered and tried to like look at all my friends over the years and seen where they've like moved. I think those are the kind of the core character traits that I saw as sort of being predictive of like which direction people moved.
I think that sounds right. I think a lot of people that I knew that would call themselves Hayekians, for example, didn't go down that path.
Yeah.
Myself included. I think of myself as a Hayekian from at least Austrian wise.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, the deontological side, the mixture there with kind of the religious aspects as well. Like there's a lot of that crossover that I think maybe lends itself more to what you're describing.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that like what you and I are describing is part of the liberal tradition, like properly, not this weird offshoot that happened in the Cold War period.
Well, holy crap, Mike. We need to come back and have another conversation when we have more time. This was absolutely very interesting conversation. Probably one of the more interesting conversations I think we've had in a while on this show. So in the interest of time, I know we've got a hard stop. I wanted to maybe ask you in 30 seconds or more, at least to our audience, why in a moment like now, where everyone's doubting liberal philosophy, where post-liberal and anti-liberal and illiberal ideas are on the rise, why do you feel like people should embrace liberal philosophy in this moment while so many others are walking away from it?
Because think of where we started and think of where we are. Um, you know, 500 years ago, most human beings were in bondage in some form or another. Most were serfs, living in some part of the idea. 500 years ago, the idea of individual ambition, of thinking that you could be more than whatever your role was in society, was such a foreign idea. It was such a foreign concept. Um, and the fact that we sit here today, and I just left my job, um, and I don't know what's going to happen for me next. Like, just the idea that I could like do that, that I have options, that I can pursue, you know, different life paths, is something that liberalism gave us. I mean, this like fundamentally, the liberal idea has infused our culture to the point that like we don't even recognize that we're breathing it like air, and yet we are questioning its institutions that have held up this substrate upon which like I am able to be this free thinking, free agent, in our society. Um, it turns out right now, obviously, like, trying to convince people that they should be very aware of this, because they're breathing liberal air right now. That's what they're doing. And they need to be very, very careful about messing around with the oxygen supply.
Well said. Where can people go to maybe read more of your work or learn more about your takes?
I just started a new Substack, mikebrock.substack.com, where I'm going to be writing regularly, and you can follow me on Twitter, at BrockM,
Awesome.
or X, whatever.
It's Twitter. It's always Twitter. Uh,
It's always Twitter.
Thank you again, Mike, and thank you, Max, for taking time today out of your schedule. Project Liberal is a cross-partisan coalition of people committed to the defense of a free and open society against authoritarians who are trying to undermine it. You can join the coalition, become a member at projectliberal.org, or set up a membership at projectliberal.org/member. We appreciate your time, everyone. Have a wonderful day.